Good afternoon, everyone, especially to Ma'am Dang. This is Jake R. Lopez, the next reporter for this group. So, without further ado, let's get started. Materials should take into account that learners differ in affective attitude. As an educator, we should consider the feelings of each student. Some learners aren't appreciative when you give them a materials or task. On the other hand, there are students who are more into materials. That is why we need to assess our classroom before providing them a materials. And according to Dulay, Burt, and Krashen in 1992, the learner's motives, emotions, and attitudes screen what is presented in the language classroom. This effective screening is highly individual and results in different rates and results. The student's response will depend on what language is presented on the classroom. Every student will have a different impact. Ideally, language learners should have strong and consistent motivation, and they should also have positive feelings towards the target language, their teachers, their fellow learners, and materials they are using. In learning the English language or whatever language you want to master, there must be something that motivates you. There must be something that motivates the language learner to keep going and to keep the fire burning in learning that language. It could be their future endeavors or anything they want to achieve in the future. Setting a goal would also suffice to maximize everything. Our motivation would help us to be consistent in pursuing the things that we want. And when it comes to classroom settings, that consistent motivation has the ability to help the language learners to be patient in learning the target language. But of course, ideal learners do not exist, and even if they exist one day, they would no longer be ideal learners the next day. There are days that the language learners are motivated, however, there are also days that the language learners aren't motivated. Each class of learners using the same materials will differ from each other in terms of linguistic and short-term motivation. Even though they are using the same materials, each student has their own approach or understanding about that materials in terms of linguistic and short-term motivation. They have their own attitudes about the language, their teachers, their fellow learners, and of attitudes towards the language. Obviously, no materials developer can cater for all these affective variables, but it is important for anybody who is writing learning materials. They need to be aware about the different understanding of the students in the learning materials because they should have a one goal, and that goal is to get the main objective of the learning materials to the students. And according to Lash and Freeman and Long in 1991, one obvious implication for the material developer is to diversity language instruction as much as possible, based upon the variety of cognitive styles and the variety of affective attitudes likely to be found amongst typical class of learners. There are the ways of doing it. Providing choices of different types of text, providing choices of different types of activities, providing optional extras for the more positive and motivated learners, providing variety, including units in which the value of learning English is a topic for discussion, including units in which the value of learning English is a topic for discussion, including units in which the value of learning English is a topic for discussion, including activities which involve the learners in discussing their attitudes and feelings about the course and the materials. Researching and catering for the diverse interests of the identified target learners, giving general and specific advice in teachers, giving general and specific advice in the teacher's book on how to respond to negative learners. For example, not forcing reluctant individuals to take part in group work. Those are the things that the writers should consider when writing a materials, for the reason that considering those ways would help the learner in understanding the given materials. And the next one is materials should permit a silent period at the beginning of instruction. It has been shown that it can be extremely valuable to delay second language speaking for beginners of a language until they have gained sufficient confidence in understanding it or understanding the language. In the classroom, the students has their own coping mechanism. Some learners easily get the point and some learners aren't, which is why we need to help the language learners to master this, how to gain their confidence when it comes to speaking. In time, they will be able to understand it. Students can use the silent period to gather their thoughts and to facilitate the development of an effective internalized grammar. This silent period has the ability to help the learner to achieve proficiency when they eventually start to speak the second language. However, some learners they seem to use the silence to avoid learning the language, or they are just afraid to speak since they haven't mastered the English language yet. Most researchers would agree that forcing immediate production in the new language can damage the reluctant speaker affectively and linguistically, and many would agree with Dulay, Burt, and Krashen that communication situations in which students are permitted to remain silent or respond in their first language may be the most effective approach for the early phases of language instruction. This approach approximates what language learners of all ages have been observed to do naturally, and it appears to be more effective than forcing full two-way communication from the very beginning of the second language acquisition. So meaning, the students are permitted to remain silent, but they also have a choice to speak in their first language. And this is an effective approach for the early phase of language instructions. During my high school days, I remember I had this teacher who always translate the first language of the students into the second language. And with the help of our teacher, we are able to understand and connect with the given materials and instructions. And since I experienced this, I could say that this strategy or approach is very helpful to the students than forcing the students to speak with a language that they haven't mastered yet. The important point in this part is that the materials should not force premature speaking in the target language, and they should not force silence either. And these are the ways of giving learners the possibility of not speaking until they are ready. Include starting the course with the total physical response or TPR approach, in which the learner responds physically to oral instructions from a teacher or CD. When we talk about TPR or total physical response, is it method of teaching language or vocabulary concepts by using physical movement to react to verbal input. With the help of TPR, we are able to demonstrate the word through speech and movement. And the next one is starting with the listening comprehension approach, in which the learner listens to stories in the target language or in the English language, which are made accessible through the use of sound effects, visual aids, and dramatic movement by the teacher. And permitting the learners to respond to target language questions by using their first language or through drawings and gestures. And if you observe that the learner is having a difficulty to express his thoughts and ideas, you can give them the permission to speak using their first language. And that concludes my report. The last remaining topic of this part will be discussed by Mr. Russell Pabustan. Thank you for listening.
trees and all